Yeah, and with that, I hope I didn't forget anything. I'll give the word over to Martin. Martin Guinard is the co-curator, or one of the co-curators of our exhibition, Critical Zones, Observatories for Earthly Politics, which is currently still running at ZKM. And he's currently working at Luma in Arles. So, hi, Martin.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. And again, thank you to ZKM to organize this thing, because this is really one of the ongoing concerns going with the exhibition Critical Zone. As you probably know, the notion of a critical zone, which does imply a shift in the representation that we give ourselves of the world, a representational shift, not of this kind of globe, but of this fragile membrane, this really, fragile space where, variety of, the rock, the water, the air do interact together. And I stress the importance of this different representation of the world as really something fragile and heterogeneous, rather than, this idea of a global, of the globe, of the globalization, notably because we do know that the art world has been working a lot, within this imaginary of the globalization. Like a nice side of it, which has been this whole idea of mondialité, this whole idea of cultural exchange, of opening up toward various cultural practices. And that's really something that is, incredible and extremely wealthy and rich. The problem is that this is also done in many cases at the cost of a huge environmental extractivism or pollution or degradations. And therefore, there's really a kind of tension that is really hard to cope with between, living within a sustainable world, living within the critical zone, and on the other hand, sustaining this idea of mondialité as well, of cultural exchange. So that's why I'm really happy that we have gathered here, thanks to the work of Jessica, of Stefan, and of the ZKM staff. We've gathered really interesting practitioners, whether it is the curator Oliver Kandt and the artist Edith Morales, the artist Jakob Stinson, the theorist and curator Marco Baravalle, or the artist and activist Pia Lindman, who are all in different places now. To give you a bit of a very brief idea of what will be the decorum today, we're gonna go hopefully into some experimental artistic practices with agriculture within Mexico. We're gonna go towards some VR with Jakob. We're gonna go towards probably some form of criticism of the biennial model with Marco Baravalle, with experimental artist village with an architecture with Pia Lindman. So I really look forward to this discussion, because specifically there is this tension that is very hard to revolve around again between cultural exchange and resources exhaustions. And that these two, unfortunately, are connected when we are in the kind of circuits of mobility, hypermobility that we know of today. So maybe we could start with the practice of Edith Morales and Oliver. Maybe you can tell us a bit, like how is your practice revolving around these questions of mobility and this question of agricultures, of sustainability, pretty much.
Okay. Hola, mi trabajo en esta pandemia o en esta movilidad me ha limitado a visitar a las comunidades, que es donde yo recolecto información de las semillas y entrevista a los campesinos.
Okay. So you've been very limited by the pandemic in terms of the cities that you had to go through. I found that you had to shrink down the territory on which you were.
Yeah. Yes.
And I'd like to go on to puedes continuar.
Sí. Sí.
Yeah. But can you a bit extend on, you know, like how your practices has evolved within this context?
¿Cómo ha evolucionado con este contexto?
Lo que he estado visitando algunas comunidades, más limitado, pero a la vez en un espacio habilitado para sembrar lo que he aprendido en las comunidades. Entonces esto me llevó a ver cómo la planta se va a desarrollar, pero en un espacio que yo estoy creando. O sea, movió mi arte hacia yo producir la milpa, el sistema.
So if you want, Martin, I can help in translating. So Edith, during this pandemic, also her practice that was very attached to being in communities because she's working with the milpa system of corn here in Mexico. So now has shifted that she habilitated a space here that where she can also translate these knowledges from farmers and fields into more here where we are in Oaxaca City, a more urban context where she can also explore the possibilities of the crops cycles here in that space. So that's how one effect of these times.
So in a way, you had to concentrate on a smaller spectrum, and did you have any unexpected outreach from this?
Ajá, como que te has tenido que enfocar en un aspecto más cercano, pero también una como expresividad más grande también.
Sí, eso me permitió reconceptualizar la información que tengo de cómo es tan importante este trabajo que hacen los campesinos de respeto a la tierra, al agua, y que ellos producen su propia comida.
Yeah, so what Edith is mentioning is that this helped her to reconceptualize how it is so very important, this connection that the farmers have, and also the respect they have for the land, the water, and the resources, as well, within this spectrum that you were mentioning about.
Très bien. I think we're going to come back and re-explore that, further within the discussion, because this is really like the first branch. But maybe we can ask Pia to talk to us at this point a bit on how, let's say, working within close perimeters has been orchestrated through your practice, pretty much.
I suppose this is referring to the village, the eco village in Finland, south part of Finland, pretty much smack in the middle of the forest. And I was actually thinking, relating to what was just being said, how actually, thankfully, the pandemic really has made it so that one of the biggest three aims that our village has had, we just turned 10 years. One was to build sustainably using natural materials, straw bales and clay and recycled materials. And we're pretty much like, we are still building, but we have been able to build homes for ourselves. Then the second is to produce and reproduce sustainably as much as possible collectively and on site. So producing our own food, also creating situations where we can work from here rather than have to travel a lot. And then the third, which is no least, is our sort of how we can support each other in our lives, this social connection, and how to sort of generate and regenerate social relations that are supportive to one another. And what happened with the pandemic was that we finally had time to stop and start building our gardens. So this is our first year that we are well along the way of actually having our own food.
That sounds quite amazing. But can you tell us a bit how big is this village that you've been working on, and when did it start, pretty much?
Yeah, we started 2011. We've been working many years before that. Some of us even 10 years. But I joined the group maybe 2008, 2009, 2008, and it was actually a former student of mine who got me involved. So we've been looking for land for a while. And then 2011 is when we found an old farm that we all fell in love with. And I mean, we've been working really from scratch, really starting with building the houses and all this. We are quite small. We are 7 people who funded or founded the whole thing and also funded. But we also have a lot of newcomers, so-called newcomers, people who are renting, who are participating in our practices to see whether they want to commit to also start living here full time and more sort of on a permanent basis. That's also a process that has its challenges, but I'm not going to go into that. Was that answering your question?
Well, it sort of is, but of course, we will have to talk about some of the challenges that lead the very point, I guess, in a second step. First of all, we're going to try to picture what the village is and what kind of activity do you do, like in it. Is it, like how, is it a Monday way of living, or do you have of course, there is this strong agenda of, as you're saying, community building, question of production and reproduction. Where do you place your artistic practice in relationship to this mode of life that you're trying to build up, literally?
At some point, I was really feeling like the village is the most important thing I've ever done in my life. And I was completely prepared to sort of forget about everything else. And yes, I definitely see this as a project where whatever I'm learning is going to be feeding into whatever I will continue to do in my life. So art comes with it. If there's art practice, it comes from this. But we also have a lot of, almost everyone who is here is either in alternative care or construction, and a lot of creative work is being done. We're very different people. So it's very difficult to kind of start to say that, give details about how the art becomes in this situation. I think it's developing in so many different ways. We actually have a guy here who came from a war-ravaged area, and for many years he was just not talking much, but spending a lot of time in the forest, and we could just see that he's starting to feel better over time. And the one thing that he has, first he connected with the animals, and then he would spend days in the forest, and he would slowly start to bring stuff with him from the forest, dead trees and mushrooms. And then now he's actually building things. And he's inventing his own art practice, and it comes from absolutely no predisposed idea of that he should be an artist or anything. So maybe that's a good description of what can happen in a village like that. I don't know.
At least there's in what you described, maybe I get it wrong. I'm trying to transport myself there, since I've not been in person there. I've been there through the text that you get online to describe it. And but there's a question of pace, a question of slowness in what you're talking about. How do you bring that matter of slowness? And that's a question I will ask as well again to all of you within this, day-to-day life, pretty much.
Yeah, it is definite. Because at the same time as we've been building this and building our relations, I've also been, for instance, professor at a university here in Helsinki, close by. And I definitely can relate to this, that you're literally living in different temporalities. And to some degree, it's been good for me, because leaving the university, coming here, I get into a different temporality, but it's not always as easy as that. Maybe one thing that I really feel is pertinent to say is that there are so many things that only happen through time that you just can't force it. And so, and that's probably one of the things that I feel has been so good for me personally in terms of everything I do now, is that I understand that you just have to be there with the time that it takes. You're asking me questions that I'm not prepared to answer, and I'm like getting into this very esoteric field.
No, it's absolutely like talking about these different, you know, like temporalities is going to be, it seems to be, at least when we hear about your eco-village, that's something that you're trying to build upon, like to create a pace, pretty much. And on this question of pace, actually, I'd like to ask a question to Marco Baravalle, who's an art critic, who's got some opinion about, let's say, one of the big modes that define the temporality of the art world, that is biennals. Marco, can you tell us a bit what's your position with the model making of exhibitions at the moment? You're muted. You're muted, yeah, Marco.
Sorry, now you should hear me. I would like to begin with the issue of mobility very quickly. And I think, first of all, my idea about art mobility doesn't come from like a theoretical analysis. It comes from a practice, which is, this practice is called Sale Docks, which is the space and the collective I'm part of in Venice. And it's a space that we occupied 13 years ago in the historical city of Venice. It was an abandoned or non-used former salt warehouse in Venice. So from that strange point of view, like being part of an art common, myself and the other people kind of developed a certain critique of art mobility. And I think that art mobility is ecologically unsustainable, because I think it's politically unsustainable, because it is inscribed, or at least during the last 30 years, it was more and more inscribed within the logic of neoliberalism. Let's think, for example, of the exponential growth. I think the whole art world was guided by the same idea of the market itself. You know, this exponential growth, the explosion of biennials around the world during the 90s and early 2000s. The idea that these events had to be bigger and bigger, and the idea that the criteria of success, for example, for a biennale like the Biennale of Venice, is a criteria of quantity of countries participating, quantity of people coming, quantity of collateral events, and so on and so forth. So there's this idea of the neoliberal event that totally occupied the spectrum of what was before called by someone like a flexible institution like the Biennale, or the unstable institution. And I don't see this instability at work anymore.
What do you mean? What do you mean by an unstable? What do you mean by an unstable?
I'm quoting, for example, an article by Carlos Basualdo, I think written in the early 2000s, in which that was titled "The Unstable Institutions," and it was about the biennial and biennials being, in comparison to the more rigid museum, the ideal art institutions to engage in a dialogue with globalization without, you know, the rigidity of museums, for example. Well, I think that nowadays, at least in Europe, museums were much better than biennials. So museums have developed a much more effective critique of neoliberalization. So I think, first of all, that the problem of the mobility that we inherited and we're part of, it's first of all because it is inspired to this idea of exponential growth, and secondly because it is a mobility that it is sort of, I think, masked as a sort of romantic nomadism while I think it is, it's not really radical. It doesn't have a lot of the radicality of the nomad. It is more that we cruise in a space that is not radical. It's not political in itself, or it is, but it is political to the extent that it is a space of representation of politics. You know, the idea that the global art system, it is ambivalent. It is on one side a safe space for, you know, the expression or connection of radicalities, of dialogues, etc. On the other hand, it is a very powerful, I would say, dispositif to valorize these radicalities that we often discuss within the context of the global art world. And I think this ambivalence is something that we should deal with. And let me just finish by something that came to my mind, because you mentioned mondialité, you mentioned Édouard Glissant. And I think, of course, you know, the contribution by Édouard Glissant was incredibly important. And it is still very important now. Ideas such as mondialité or creolization, etc. But at the same time, I think it is about time, because it's 2021, and it is about time to ask ourselves what in which ideological project this theory was inscribed. I think this is a question that we should ask ourselves. Speaking of the Biennale of Venice, I remember in 2003, I was an art student in Venice, and there was the time when the Biennale hosted Utopia Station, an exhibition curated by Ansuri Kobrist, by Molly Nesbitt, and by Rirti Tirabanija. This was deeply theoretically indebted to this idea of Édouard Glissant creolization, and this generation of curators, the explosion of the biennials, this, I would say, mature moment of art globalization promoted a very precise image of the world that was drawn by Glissant. The world was described as an archipelago of connected islands. And this archipelago of connected islands was basically kept together by dialogue, by keeping together the differences. I think it is about time to ask ourselves, whose utopia was that utopia? Was the utopia of the subalterns around the world? Was the utopia of, and when I say subalterns, I mean, you know, human and non-human subalterns, or was it the utopia of neoliberal globalization itself? No, so that's a question. I don't have an answer, but I think that
it's a very interesting, you know, like we come very close to what, you know, like, which is completely connectable to the ideas of Glissant as well, but, you know, like of what Bonolato would describe as two different processes of globalization, the globalization minus and the globalization plus. One globalization allowing various forms of exchange of knowledge, various ways of enriching connections and between people, and one other one which is down to like a hegemonic machine, a hegemonic problem. And that's, of course, like an extremely important topic to discuss, like whose ideals was behind that, and also, like, you know, what are the consequences 2 decades later, of course, since we are right now in a shift of paradigm, as you're saying. Maybe this is really something we're going to explore further, but I'd like to ask a question to Jakob, because time is going on. Notably in this question of mobility, Jakob, you're an artist working with VR, with virtual reality. And can you talk to us a bit about this practice of pretty much making an artwork that is accessible from, you know, like opening up a horizon from a space that could pretty much be sent about anywhere?
Yeah, I think a good starting point to me to talk a little bit about my practice is actually this over there camera that's someone put in there. There was an eagle before. So in my practice, what I do is really like, now there's no eagle, but before suddenly there was an eagle. It was unexpected. No, I mean, okay, it's the nest. We go to the nest. We have an idea. There might be a bird, but there might not be a bird. So in my practice, I spent maybe like a full year in a landscape. So for the past year, I spent a year here, my background in the Camargue in France, in Arles. And I was looking for formations in the landscape that looked different from anything I could imagine. So I looked at these formations together with a field biologist and with a collaborator, Matt McCorkle, a sound artist. So we spent like really long time in the actual landscape, looking at it through the eyes of other people who have spent like decades on the location and kind of learning from these eyes. And through these eyes, you know, we learn to find things like this. So this is like these strange formations in the landscape.
I love how you're in the middle of what you're seeing.
This is like green screen TV in the 90s.
Yeah,
like,
pretty much. I like how like this is the 90s that you were talking about with you know, Glissant and
yeah. So it's like each little object in this landscape, you know, they're digitized. So I go out and spend really long time in the different landscapes and then digitize the individual elements and try to look for overlooked natural histories or landscapes that we've kind of forgotten or not think about. So for the past 2 years, I've been focusing on wetlands because basically all larger civilizations in the world, big cities, are built around wetlands. So this is kind of a liver of the landscape that's able to filter toxins and create fresh water. So if you have a large amount of people living anywhere in the world, either they're nomads or they live by a wetland. It's just a fact. There doesn't exist any big civilization or city in the world that's not built by a swamp, a river, or a lake. It's just, you need these things to survive in a larger group of people. But since even 1800, the wetland and kind of the swamp has been seen as negative. So I'm kind of focusing on reviving these perspectives and spending really long periods of time, like a year in each location. So this is in France, I was working there. And now I'm in Berlin, working with the Museum of Natural History and field biologists. So we are making like a digital swamp from around Berlin. So this is like a virtual landscape, but it's made by going out in the field and recording and working with archives in the museum and talking to the scientists about their kind of more like emotional memories connected to the landscape. And then basically that's what I do as an artist. So like I go to a landscape with different kind of collaborators from, see here, there's a bird. Awesome. You know, it's landed on the camera. This kind of life force that is really interesting to me working with. I mean, I use not just VR, I use many different media, but basically it's like there's a landscape. I go to that landscape with my studio. I find local collaborators, people who know it. We work together over a long period of time and kind of find some perspectives that might be relevant to show others. So then this, of course, then enters museums in different places. And then I work with local exhibition producers or equipment there. So there's no shipping involved in my entire practice. There's zero, almost. Maybe a computer we bring somewhere so it can it can show the work. Yeah, I see it kind of as my purpose as an artist is almost being a medium or a channel. It's like it's from the landscape, from perspectives.
Sorry, I didn't hear. To be a what?
A kind of medium, you know, like I'm able to utilize a kind of craft or technology that can reach a lot of people in different locations. And you can do this from a local place and not really have any physical impact on the landscape. Yet I can give kind of an idea of the diversity of how the world can look and feel like outside of what we're doing like on Zoom right now. Like I believe that from this paradigm of sitting like on a screen, we cannot really encounter kind of unexpected perspectives or sensations or imaginations of what the world can feel like and be like. So that is kind of the core of my practice of what I do.
I think that there's a point that I do appreciate in what you just said, which is that, okay, so you come to a place, you spend a long time there, you try to do a sort of field work, and then it can be shipped at almost no cost, no limited environmental cost. Stefan could actually did the calculation for what VR cost in terms of CO2 emissions, but I mean, the idea being that it's relatively low. But then, of course, you grasp only one local aspect, and you might ask, you know, like why people in, I don't know, in an exhibition in China would care that much about, you know, something that they would see in Camargue, in the south of France.
Right.
And there's like that's a question that I'd be happy to ask you.
Yeah, can I answer now, or is this for later?
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one thing is, of course, like this, for example, this is from the Camargue, but it's also just like part of reality. It's like the natural world can be shaped by sun, salt, and algae, and it can look different than kind of, I had no idea it could look that way once you look in the detail. So this is relevant wherever you are. Like you show this to someone in Shenzhen in China, a young person in a city, and all of a sudden they're like, wow, this looks like some fantasy, some weird thing, but really it's just like you walk outside and you look in the detail anywhere and you can find this. So this is kind of what I do in a way. So like in a way, it's, yeah, you can show this like in the Camargue in France, as a kind of, it's connected to salt industry, change of landscapes, the Mediterranean. But you can also extract it from that and just make it about like this is what I believe, it's what I tell myself to kind of keep making these things. But just showing that the world can look different than what you imagine.
It's a good way to answer that okay, you offer a sort of map for projection. We lost the projection actually at this, but like that you're offering a surface of projection where people can kind of see what they find relevant and see ways of literally find a connection with it. It's also interesting. I mean, what I don't think it's by chance that you're starting the description of your work by stressing the importance of wetland and places of settling for human activity. I think that's also like another entry point. The fact that where there's been wetlands, there's been developments of bigger city, and that this was not made by chance. Although, I mean, you just as a side note, when you mentioned the moment when the wetlands become places that are less that are seen as not as deserts, on the contrary, but as scary spaces. There's plenty of reasons for that, with stagnant water bringing all sorts of disease, all sorts of death rates, etc. And you can feel that very much. And I'm sure that's something that you can give a perception of that through your artwork. I think it's maybe something that like I'd be interested in knowing what Marco, you make of those kind of practices, because you mentioned this notion of romantic nomadism a bit earlier, and in a way, bringing a piece of landscape which is supposed to have like which does have actually kind of extraordinary qualities, and bringing that visual projection in another part of the world, like would that enter into your description of what romantic nomadism would be, or quite on the contrary, it doesn't? We don't hear you.
Yes, because I always mute myself and then I forget to unmute. I don't know. When I say romantic nomadism, I simply mean romanticization of the model of mobility that is typical to the art world. So I wouldn't really put it in touch with Jacob's practice necessarily. I think it's only this thing that is the life of many of us, the average life, so that we the pre-pandemic average life, so that we move from city to city, from festival to festival, from biennial to biennial, etc., etc. So. And I see sometimes that, of course, it is a good way to live. Now we know that is ecologically unsustainable, but I also would like to, my point is that I would like to suggest also political critique, that I think that many times we move and we discuss about, radical topics, we show radical art, we produce radical art. And I think it's important. Of course, I don't want to sort of disempower anyone, or to think that I can judge someone. But at the same time, I think that all this production, this critical production of ours, goes into channels that are totally in tune with the market, with a neoliberal idea of society and politics. That's why we thought of, let's say, opposing to neoliberal mobility something that we call radical permanence. And I think radical permanence is something that is really embodied, for example, in the practices that we've been hearing here, the one by Edith or by Pia. I think these are examples of radical permanence. That doesn't mean necessarily that we are into the glorification of the local. That's not my point. I don't glorify the local per se, but I think that we take care also of our being rooted in places, because at the same time, you know, even if the artwork has this very deterritorialized image, our institutions, biennials, museums, galleries, wherever they land, when this very, I would say, ephemeral artwork lands somewhere, it affects the life there. It affects the public space. And most of the time, it affects it in, again, following a neoliberal logic. So boosting real estate rent, narrowing public space, and so on and so forth. And promoting a type of art that is pretty much linked to global financial capitals. And Venice, under this point of view, is a very interesting point of observation, because the Biennale is, for example, is the realm of precarious labor, and at the same time, around the business of renting spaces for the Biennale, for the collateral events of the Biennale, it mobilizes an economy of dozens of billions of euros every year, you know? So it is a machine through which, again, the cities become places of rent and not of good quality labor or you know, art production. That's why this is a very, very well-known, let's say, critical theory that links the artwork and gentrification. I'm not saying anything new, but I'm just saying that while we move in this global art circuit, art and art institutions have some effects on the realities we live in, on the local. And I think that it is important also to take care of this dimension, to offer alternatives to these effects, to these neoliberal links between the artwork and the urban space. And at the same time, I'm not saying that we cannot move anymore. We need to change the priorities, our priorities for which we move. If we move, we don't have to move in according to a neoliberal logic. We have to move according to other type of logics. It is, you know, the necessity, I think, to go out of what Mark Fisher called the capitalist realism. The idea that there are also other possible infrastructure, even global infrastructure of the artwork that have to be organized, cultivated, and have simply other priorities. Maybe not the priority of building or organizing an exhibition that attracts hundreds of thousands of people, but maybe the priority of designing an eco-village. Why not?
No, that's a very good way, like to open up on this really beautiful way that you have of describing this, what you call radical permanence, which I think is a very beautiful way of capturing practices that are going to try to not necessarily to different practices that are going to try to not deterritorialize too quickly. Let's say not to go towards you know, too much of a fast pace too quickly. And on this, I'd like to come back a bit to the practice of Edith and Oliver, actually, as well as a curator. Like, what does it suggest to you when you hear this question of this contrast between this neoliberal regime of hypermobility and this radical permanence that Marco is talking about? How does that connect with you?
Esta pues idea como de también, bueno, de lo que estaba hablando Marco también, cómo se conecta con tu práctica.
Mi trabajo ha sido con las comunidades, en donde lo importante es la vida, forma de vida, y su patrimonio es el agua, la tierra y su semilla.
Okay, so like, yeah, she works with the communities where, yeah, the important is the water, the territory, and the seeds.
Y que es su vida. Para ellos, esto que está colapsando nuestro mundo occidental, nuestro mundo global.
So for them, this is their life. So for them, this is collapsing. So these global schemes.
Su vida ha sido al margen, no 100% de este colonialismo, pero se mantienen en resistencia.
So their lives is not completely into these schemes 100%, but they are also in a sort of resistance to it.
Ellos siguen manteniendo su forma de vida con muy poca interferencia de la pandemia. Su movilidad casi no se afectó, o su forma de vida.
So they keep their own life even in the pandemics with slight changes. No, is not affecting them too much. They have a different sort of a way of approaching it.
Entonces, mi trabajo de arte es como esta fuerza o esta política, posición política, económica y social los mantiene fuerte, pero aún así el poder económico les quiere arrebatar su forma de vida, quitándoles sus semillas.
So in that case, her work is this political position of how these economic and social strengths they are fighting against, and how these industries are also trying to take out from them their ways of living.
Entonces, yes.
That's very interesting, but how, how do you intervene specifically? What are the strategies? That you depict very well the context, but how do you specifically intervene?
Okay.
¿Cómo están tus intervenciones como un artista en este contexto?
Mi responsabilidad, porque los he acompañado por 10 años, es cómo pongo en plataformas diferentes, como circuitos de arte, esta situación que ellos viven, cómo la doy a conocer.
Yeah, so how to give sort of a presentation on how they, this sort of political and also even cosmological ways of living, how can it be presented with art to different places? No, how can you also present them as alternatives also through these other schemes, no? Through the presentation of arts.
Y es a través de conceptualizar esta información y esta situación en piezas de arte para evidenciar la importancia de la biodiversidad que existe en las comunidades y es poderosa.
So how to conceptualize this situation through artworks and to remark the importance of how this biodiversity that is in many places like very vast in time and also in sort of even genetical information, how it's very, very important not only for the past, also for the future, not only for these communities, but also for different communities in different places.
Y como ellos tienen, como decía Carlos, diferentes ritmos de tiempo de vida. Se rigen por los ritmos de la siembra de la milpa.
How the farmers have also, like Marco was telling, different temporalities in which these temporalities that they live in is about the cycles of the milpa crops.
Que donde hay tiempos para trabajar, para descansar y para celebrar.
Where there's a time to work, to rest, and also to celebrate this life cycle, so to speak.
I think you need to re-explain very quickly what the milpa is.
The milpa, yes.
Yes.
Maybe we'll do this in English, so that. But the milpa is a permacultural technique, so which mixes
milpa here. So it's a very ancient concept because it's a system. Basically, is the combination of corn seeds in a field together with beans, seeds, and squash and other medicinal crops and chili, but together they sort of make a symbiotic relation in the land that one plant is contributing to the other one, and they are reducing so the factors of danger, so they all grow together well. And so this is against the current modes of monocultivos. So milpa is
completo.
This system of symbiotic.
And so, as like within your practice, it'd be really nice if you were telling us how did the rehabilitation of this technique came into your artistic practice. You know, what kind of place do you give to such a technique?
¿Cómo es que empezaste a trabajar sobre este sistema de milpa para dentro de tu práctica artística?
Porque estaba interesada, mis papás son campesinos, entonces soy la primera generación que vino a la ciudad después de mis papás. Entonces, para hablar sobre arte, yo soy artista de diferentes medios, tenía que conocer bien el tema. Y en Oaxaca hay muchas organizaciones que trabajan en defensa del maíz, y yo me acerqué a ellas y me convertí parte de este colectivo grande que defiende al maíz en Oaxaca.
So yeah, Edith is telling that so her parents were farmers, and that also she's been working with organizations here in Oaxaca. But I think also I can add to it that she's been working always on territory and also on data analysis of how the system actually obliges people to act and to live within their structures. And so she started working very closely with the milpa as an activist as well of giving information through art, because the milpa is the one factor that keeps the communities together and gives them this sort of self-sufficiency, because they have food and they take care of the territory and they take care of water, and then they have this unified front against extractivism. That is something that in Mexico we're dealing with very violently. And so to defend milpa and maize here in Mexico, it also means to defend autonomy and self-sufficiency. So that's why she conceptually also started working with milpa and with the defense of seeds, because there's a big variety of them.
I think it's a very beautiful example of radical permanence that you're giving to us, and especially radical means back to the root. Etymologically speaking, it's quite nice how you work with this. And of course, Pia, I'd like to ask you as well, like the same, because Marco set up so beautifully, let's say, the contrast between the neoliberal regime of mobility based on precarious employment, but also like a really fast-paced and this radical permanence. I'd like to ask you what it evokes you within the practice that you've had within your eco-village.
Yeah, I mean, I relate very strongly to what Marco has been saying. It's always been a part of the people who've started the village to also figure out a way to expand all the practices, not just to serve the community, but also to sort of grow within yourself. So what I could do as another example is that during this time, I also myself started studying healing techniques, amongst them an ancient Finnish healing technique. For various reasons, I had a bad illness that came from environmental toxins, so it sort of took me on that route already. But the village definitely has sort of supported that kind of development. And going back to the idea of the temporality, to be able to allow that development take place without having to move it into a certain kind of competitive industry sort of platform. So we help each other, we give each other treatments, we teach each other. We also now have a bigger building that is just for coursework, for giving teachings, for retreats and stuff. So there's sort of an abundance to learn from just by being here. But I also would like to say that for me, perhaps what the village taught me was to really start to see how I can exist and practice in the world without necessarily having to put it into a monetary system. So that my practice now is that I am actually doing certain kinds of sessions within the art context rather than as an industry, because I've sort of understood that what I want to achieve with this practice of subsensorial sessions is not a job or being an aspirant to somebody, but an exchange, a collaboration, where basically the work is to open up channels of the subsensorial. And I actually have, after 10 years of thinking that I'm not going to return to the art world, I actually returned to the art world because of this. So that actually the art is the place where I can practice an exchange that is, at least in that moment, not tied to a monetary exchange. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
You said opening channels. You talked about opening channels of and subsensorial. Like, can you repeat? Like,
yeah. What I talk about is that all the teachings I've learned about how to heal have, to me, started disregarding what culture, what a Finnish tradition or other traditions. What I feel happens when actual healing takes place is when you are able to help to connect with your body, not just on a sensory level, but on a subsensory level, meaning beyond what we have learned to think as what we feel. So you can literally listen to your body beyond meaning-making sensory events. And so meditation is one way of getting to it, but there are many different other ways of doing it. And here, coming back to I think it's question of art is still this, that actually, I think this is where art and healing is sharing a space.
That's a very nice way of talking, about like this extension of sensitivities. We're reaching out, toward the end of the first part, where we're going to take a small break right now that is going to be introduced by Jessica and by Benoit. But really, we will, continue after the small break. Like, we will have small breakouts with Q&A, and then, please come back after that. But it's been a quite already, like we've seen some quite interesting material coming out. Again, I think if we start with this, contrast between the context within which mondialité, cultural exchange dynamic emerges is the one of neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is also what created the ecological mutation. We still have that problem. We still have that tension between, having opening practices and, dialogue between various perspectives, opening up those perspectives, and the material impact that they have in terms of CO2. But it's true that through these discussions already, we have quite powerful examples of practices such as the one that Edith has with, a very dedicated attention and focus of attention on those permacultural techniques. Jakob with his representation of the wetlands that can be, traveling and also can be immersive and hopefully talk to a variety of people, and of course, Pia, with what you talked to us about this kind of regime of sensitivity of a small village. We're gonna go to a break right now, but when you come back, I think really what we have to talk about in terms of mobility is going to be like a very practice-based element. That is, what in your practice would still require traveling of yourself, of traveling of material, and what can be left out? Can you really think very concretely about that? And I think it can be a very good topic during the breakout sessions. Which trips can you stop making? Which works can you, if you're an artist, which work can you stop shipping? What kind of practices can be thought of, and when will you lose too much by doing that? Because of course, these are complicated questions and these are struggles, and it's going to be interesting to explore those struggles together. Jessica, I'll leave it up to you now.
I'll take over at this point. Yes, Martin, maybe if you could share your question into the chat for everybody, that would be absolutely great. So huge thank you from my side to Pia, Marco, Edith, Oliver, and Jakob. To this point, thanks for all the insights. And I would love to quickly share a comment from the chat before we go into the breakout sessions. So somebody was sharing his comment on, the aspect of locality. So as an intern in an Italian eco museum that works to preserve the history, memory, and practices of cheap transhumans across the Alps between France and Italy, I'd like to bring a small example from our work, which might be useful to point out how being rooted in locality is not necessarily a synonym of being stuck in that locality. The shepherds kept moving for all their lives, but were deeply rooted, maybe in more places at the same time, also creating art in their houses in the Croix region of France, which they shared between them for generations. Everybody left some sort of signature in those buildings. So I guess movement, rootedness, and creativity can go along together. That was really nice, I thought. Thank you for the comment.
That's so beautiful.
So, because things get lost easily in the chat. So what was going to happen, or what's going to happen now, actually, Martin, we completely forgot, is our artistic intervention, our activation.
Absolutely.
So everybody was listening very carefully for a very long time now. So I would like our audience to turn on their camera. I mean, we don't oblige you to, but if you feel welcome with it, turn on your camera, and I'll get the floor to Benoit.
I think we got it. Thank you, everybody. I didn't expect it would work so well, and I'm glad that we saw a little bit of outsides, because I feel we missed it a little bit. Thank you, and I let you, Jessica, to take over.
Merci, Benoit. I think after sitting for quite a while, walking and standing up is already good to get your head free. And I think that's the right moment when we are ready to go into our breakout session. So, Moritz, we are 62 persons at the moment. Are you ready to split us up? So, yes. Just for your information, before we go into the breakout room. So, let me quickly recap the question from Martin. Once the pandemic is over, hoping it will, what are the trips you personally want to stop? What are the ones you should keep? So in the sense of mobility in the art world. And you will be split up automatically into the groups now. And feel free to join. As I said before, if you don't feel comfortable of being thrown there, just feel welcome to come back into the main session. And timing is 10 minutes, and we see each other again. So please don't leave. We'll have the question and answer afterwards with our panelists. And yes, I would say Moritz. Hello back, everyone. So that was quick 10 minutes, I guess. I hope you had a good time. So let me just quickly check my notes, what's going to happen. So we have the question and answer possibility. And now I will just remind you of the possibility of just posting your questions directly into the chat. So we have one, at least one from earlier, and let's maybe wait for another 1 or 2 minutes for everybody else to be back again. And maybe Moritz, I can ask you to pin the speakers again.
Yes.
So that we can all see them. One of the questions that came in very, very early in the panel discussion was, what makes a practice an art practice? That is a super general question, but I'd like to pose it anyways. Maybe Pia or Jakob, would you like to take that one?
Maybe it's nice for Pia since I took the time in the breakout session.
So you leave me with this tricky question. That's great though. I have another story to tell that I hope could answer part of it. Well, yeah, I mean, I've been really worrying about this question for so long. An artist, a Skoltsami from northern Finland, who her name is Pauliina Feodorov. She's actually a theater director and a poet. She's actually going to be in the Venice Biennial 22. I was watching one of her talks. She has this amazing project where she has amassed quite a bit of money to resurrect the wandering salmon in the river, which is one of the northernmost rivers going from northern Lapland all the way to the Arctic Sea, eventually through also Russia. And it's been one of the rivers who've been a life-sustaining river for the Skoltsami, of which there are only 300 left, which is an indigenous tribe of Sami in northern Finland. And to return the salmon to this river is about a recuperation of what is there for the tribes to still continue to live. And when she was asked, what's the role of art in this project? She answered, the role of art is to fund this project. So I really like that, because if we do have to live in this neoliberal world, I applaud this idea. Well, let's just have the art fund it. It's not a complete answer, obviously. I think that it's hard to pinpoint what an art practice is. And also with my own situation, I go out and I come back in. And for me, why the art still matters is exactly because it allows me still, nevertheless, to play with things, to play with these relations, which the non-art area doesn't allow. So actually quite much.
That's very beautiful.
Yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
No, it's a very beautiful way of talking about the space that is opened up and as a practice and as a channel of functionment. Jessica, you had maybe another.
No, but maybe I mean this an art practice as a communal practice in the way that Edith is working in Oaxaca in Mexico. I think that's already a great example, and also the Milpa concept. So maybe Edith, you would like to elaborate a little bit more on this community aspect. You've already touched it, but
sí, tú puedes como hablar más de este, como práctica comunitaria de...
La desconexión. Okay. Pero de mi proyecto, de todo, ¿no?
Sí.
Y aquí es donde se pasan las fotos, ¿no? ¿Verdad?
Si quieres.
No, sí, no. Ok. Bueno, he estado investigando las prácticas comunitarias del sistema Milpa en los últimos 10 años. Y lo más importante es que realmente importa es la conexión con la tierra.
So Edith's mentioning that for 10 years she's been working closely with these activists and farmers, and what really matters is the connection to land.
Y eso es un ejemplo para las ciudades urbanas que no tenemos no tenemos el conocimiento de cómo sembrar lo que comemos.
So that in a way unifies the community, and is a real important example for urban cities that we don't have that tight connection to land, and also to bigger communities, and also to the knowledge.
Y a partir de eso inicié un laboratorio para poder realizar huertos urbanos y compartirlos con la comunidad.
So in this, because of this, she created this space where they're doing orchards, urban orchards, also to create communities within this city context that we live in.
Y realizar esta encierro de pandemia me llevó a tener toda mi energía en crear este espacio que se llama Milpa Urbana.
Yeah, so then also, yeah, to create this space that's called Milpa Urbana in this pandemic.
Y es utilizando sistemas tradicionales de siembra de los campesinos, aplicar los ritmos de la luna, los tiempos de la luna, si la tierra es muy pobre, cómo darle vivacidad y mantener el sistema Milpa. Entonces este es mi nuevo proyecto de arte.
So yeah, it's looking into this sort of agricultural systems, such as the weather or the moon cycles for the plantings, and also supporting organically the soils that to be having better possibilities. Yeah, so this is how this project has been developing and creating these sort of new communities.
Porque no hay otra manera más que si los campesinos dan su vida en la problemática política social que viven por desplazamiento de territorio.
So in that way, there's no other way, since the farmers are giving their life, ¿no? Dando su vida ¿para qué?
Por los desplazamientos que el poder económico los mueve.
So giving their life and that the political struggles that are pushing them away. ¿No?
Ellos, ahorita estoy trabajando más como en defensa de la semilla.
So that's why she's also working strategic, focusing on the seeds and the importance and relevance of keeping alive the seeds, also through planting, ¿no?
Ajá. Sembrando, compartiendo.
Growing them and sharing them.
Y dando información, porque en México va a entrar la comercialización y patentar las semillas, entonces los campesinos no van a poder compartir.
And giving information, because of Mexico through the economic treaties are doing new patents for the seeds and privatizations, and then the farmers won't be able to have these millenary seeds that they have grown over centuries and over like many generations.
I think we have a very important point there, which actually it makes me think of something that you were saying, Marco, when you were again coming back about your question of radical permanence, is that of course there's the question of conservatism that can be put, that there is one of the problems is the coming back to a very conservative vision of what the local is. And I think that there's something quite beautiful in the practice of Edith here, is that, trying to preserve this locality has nothing conservative, because there's such a powerful and strong, neoliberal force of extractivism that tries to suck out from it, to appropriate forms of knowledge that have been grown up and which are pretty much being stolen, appropriated, and replicated to do all of those kinds of patents where corporations will be able to make huge amount of money without retributing the local communities. It's a very interesting example of a it's technique of conservation that are not conservative, but rather, or at least conservative in a very defending way, where the balance of power is not is one of resistance against a big machine. But don't you think, so that's really a beautiful example of that, but don't you think that there is in other kind of practices, Marco, this risk of a conservative turn?
Well, I think that you said it very well, and the link between art mobility and, for example, the problem of patenting life of the seeds, that this fight that for the conservation of traditional knowledge, for the conservation of common property over seeds that Edith is fighting through our practice is really linked to neoliberal art mobility, because both things, mobility and the patenting of life, have the same logic behind it. That is extraction, like culture. I would say agricultural.
How would you? Yeah.
Because mobility, as it is, neoliberal art mobility wants as one goal the extraction of financial value from what it moves, or from the places where the movement is organized. So, for example, the extraction from financial value from the urban space through gentrification, or the extraction of financial value from radical theory, radical practices, etc. So that's where I see the structural link between things that are different. The structural link is that they share the same extractivist logic, be them artwork or agricultural industry or agricultural multinational. Maybe the second one are much more damaging than the first one, of course. And maybe the first one is a space that we can still inhabit, but we don't have to be naive in when we look at the artwork. We don't have to be naive in the way we inhabit the artwork, because even if it is, of course, it's not, the Biennale is not Monsanto, of course. I don't want to sound ridiculous, you know, but at the same time, the logic of extraction of value is something that is at work in both cases. And I would like to say more. So, for example,
can you give like? You were about to like precise that link that you're making, because I see your point on the extractivist logic, and I also see plenty of points on like hypermobility, which is the very topic that is, you know, gathering us here. But how would you, like, from which perspective there is extraction? From the institution of the biennial, which you're right to remind that it's not Monsanto, but
a very practical example. Again, what does the I think my critiques comes from, I was also saying it in the context of the small group a few minutes ago. My critique doesn't come from a theoretical analysis. It comes from the fact that being someone involved into a collective managing of an art common in Venice, I've been really seeing that art mobility does no good to the place where I'm living. In a way, it is a form of extraction. You know, it's one of the main forms of extraction. Like, for example, in Latin American farmers community, the patenting of life is the main and more violent and effective form of extraction of collective value for the sake of profitable multinationals. The artwork in Venice is participating inside the model of mass tourism, which is another way to extract value from a place where there are no farmers, of course. There is something else. There is a collective symbolic capital, which is a cultural and historical historic capital, I would say. So this is where I see the link. So the way, for example, and the way Edith, let's say, imagines and practices are being an artist there, defending life, defending the collective ownership of the seeds, defending, you know, cultural and agricultural practices that are commons there, that are part of that are owned by the people, is comparable to the way we stay in Venice through, for example, the occupation of an empty space that otherwise would be put on the market, for example, of the exhibition. And we decide not to make this space
the extractivism part. The extractivism part comes from the viewer as much as the institution in terms of your analysis right now. And sorry I interrupted you because you were talking about like what could be done with this space, and I think that was a very important
extraction comes from a model which is the model of cultural industries. The art industry is part of the core of cultural industries in a city like Venice, which is basically could be defined as a sort of cultural factory. Extractivism works also through art and culture interlinked to the tourist economy. Tourism has been incredibly damaging on Venice. We lose, of course, now it's the pandemic, so it's the crisis of that model. But 1 year ago, or we still lose 1,000 residents per year. And what I see is the way art is structured is not helping the city to become populated again. It's not helping the opening of new independent art spaces. It's not helping more cultural producers, students, workers to come and live in the city. It's more kind of helping a further gentrification of the city, helping, you know, the flight of residents. So and through, again, the extraction of value, through the privatization of spaces, through the art market, or the market of art events, which is propelled by the Biennale. So that's how it is structured. That's how, in a nutshell, you know, cultural or extractivism perpetrated by the art industry works in Venice. And our small attempt to occupy a space that otherwise would reproduce the same cultural logic, and to manage it differently, to manage it, first of all, by protecting it from being privatized. Second, by a management that comes through an open assembly of people, something that is not managed, for example, by the City Council of Venice, which is the owner of the space, because the City Council of Venice reproduces exactly the same neoliberal logics that we are criticizing. So through occupying the space, inhabiting the space, through, for example, working on the constituency of our space. We sometimes speak of alter institutions, so institutions that work differently, again, from the neoliberal logic. And constituency, it is a very important thing. Our space, beyond being a space where we organize exhibitions, workshops, and so on and so forth, it is a space that is normally used by the social movements of the city. For example, the Committee Against Big Cruise Ships that fights against the passage of big cruise ships within the city of Venice, and it is a deeply environmental, so let's say, uses the space normally. The local chapter of Ni Una Menos.
So that's on this question, on this way in which, like, you're talking about the use of space. I think Stefan had a very interesting question, and maybe Stefan, you posted it on the chat, but maybe you want to restate it about what do you think is the position? What do you think is a fruitful position for institutions to hold up, pretty much, in this context?
Well, thanks, Martin, and thanks, Marco. I think Marco just, in a way, answered that by occupying a space and just resisting privatization, this is a way to sort of perform a resistance to the extraction and the colonialization of this form of the art industry. So yeah, I think that's, for me, it's a very strong and powerful answer. But the second part of the question was, how is there a way, a possibility, and maybe you and Jacob and of course Pia, Oliver, who are also familiar with some of the global circuits of the institutionalized art market, may answer also, is there a way to occupy this network? And is there a sense of, you have a sense that there's a possibility for resistance from within, in a sense? That's the question that I'm...
The question, I think, Stefan, I would add to your question is also, where are the points of resistance? Because of course, Venice is one thing which doesn't suffer as much from extractivism, as you said it beautifully, but a very specific kind, which is synchronism, the fact that the city sinks because of its tourism. Even the weight of the touristic industry makes it sink, and not only, actually on the opposite of it's a very specific kind of extractivism, but where do you pick those fights? And global warming, pretty much. So it's like a reverted logic. It's the same logic with a reverted effect. But what's interesting is, like, where shall you pick up those fights? Because in a way, one could argue, okay, Venice is taken by this big mega machine which already functions, and then like, there's plenty of places, such as the one that Pia decided to make her own place. I'm completely playing the devil's advocate here, but I think that this is the kind of conversation which needs to happen as well. How would you answer to that, in the sense that, like, maybe there's plenty of places where initiatives such as the one of Pia can happen? How would you position yourself, both Stefan and Marco, in relation to that? And Pia, of course.
Just very briefly, and then I shut up. I think, for example, it's not, I try to answer to both your remark and Stefan question. I think that occupying a space is a possibility. designing and building an eco-village is another possibility. But I think that also there are possibilities for those institutions that are already inscribed into the neoliberal circuit for official museums or biennials or art schools. Just one example. I think the example of the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, for example, is a very important, and like more generally, the example of the whole circuit of the Museum Confederation of the Internazionale. I think these are, the Reina Sofia is a huge public art institution. It's really like a mastodon. It's a big museum with the Guernica inside, so very, very institutional. Still, in the last 10 years, they have really worked hard on their constituencies, and they've been creating instruments that, in a way, question the role, the classic role of a big museum in a big city. Let me just one example. They have something that is called the Museo Situado, the situated museum, which is an assembly that happens inside the museum itself with for example, associations of migrants or social centers or activists of the neighborhood of Lavapiés, which is the neighborhood in which the museum is based. And this is only one example, but this is an example that, in a way, proves that what is, I think, crucial now is that no matter if you're like a anarchist activist or the director of a big museum, of course, there are asymmetries and it matters, but let's say it doesn't matter. The point is that you have to not only question, everything on the level of aesthetics and epistemology, but you have to also to question your institutional structure. And this is something that is possible. It's very difficult, but it's possible to do it. And for example, the Museum of Reina Sofia proves that it is possible to do it. Is it a revolutionary machine? No, it's not. But it's a big art institution that is, that for the last 10 years have been questioning its institutional structure, its social role, and has trying to offer solutions and instruments, and has created, I think, the right alliance.
What kind of alliances? What kind of structure?
I'm reading the chat. Anna Longoni has been crucial for that to happen in Reina Sofia. That is because she's part of a very situated process in Latin America. For example, thank you for this intervention, because this is true. Another point of Reina Sofia being, I think, a very interesting example, and I'm not paid by the Reina Sofia, okay, just to be clear, is the fact that they hired Anna Longoni and they made a clear link with the Red Conceptualismos del Sur. So they made a clear link with a Southern epistemology that came to inhabit the museum. And they made, for example, some actual efforts in creating occasions and resources, for example, to save from privatization militant archives of Latin American artists, radical artists. And sometimes they succeeded. So, I think this is just I could have also mentioned other institutions, but this is, I think, very interesting because
it's interesting. Which kind of strategies? Okay, so we have the wonderful work that is done by this curator that you're mentioning, but what are kind of like strategies that can be implemented in the case of Edith and the work that Oliver you do also as a curator? Having a space where it hurts, but where nobody talks about it is already like a very important form of strategy. It's a very important front line, because like the what you do, Oliver, by putting this place in Oaxaca where you can show the work of artists such as Edith, who are literally giving a voice, helping to create a voice, helping to create a statement, helping to create a cohesion around this issue, which, because of this power relationship, is otherwise completely invisibilized, is of course of absolutely key importance. But again, like what one could really argue, and it's actually not my opinion, but it's something I would still want to argue, to poke at you, Marco, you know, a place like Venice, of course, it's in a way, it's been taken. You want to give other spaces to it, but why not, you know, choosing other battlefields where there are other forms of, you know, even more violent forms of extractivism that are occurring? Why would this discussion need to happen in Venice, according to you?
Because I completely agree. Venice is not a place where, you know, we suffer the I would say the most serious consequences of violence, of course. At the same time, Venice, it is a city that has been basically destroyed by tourism. That is in the process of being destroyed. And it could be, and it is, I think, a good laboratory for many other cities, especially in the Mediterranean area, that have invested a lot in a tourist model, and the interaction between tourism and our industry. So I think it is a symbolic. But it is a place among others. It's not that this discussion that we have is as Venice as a privileged place. I'm living in Venice, so I've been living in Venice for the last 22 years, and that's why I've been doing this. But I wouldn't say that it's particularly relevant in Venice in comparison to elsewhere.
I mean, if I may jump in at this point, I think it's crucial or important within the next years for all Western privileged bigger cities to think about these topics and to reflect upon their own footprint, of their own consequences of how we work in the cultural sector, how we do exhibitions, and many, many other questions. I like in your article, Marco, where you write about caring cities, of moving towards like building up caring spaces, caring cities. Pia, you're raising your hand.
I didn't want to stop you if you have something okay. I just wanted to say that I think that it is maybe shifting the perspective a little bit. I'm thinking of again, back to what is art. What I think is important about art for me is exactly this, how it is part of the society, part of the community that you live in. It has a certain kind of meaning within the functions of everyday life within that community. That's one. But then obviously, we talked about this before also, let's not be naive. We also need to communicate to a bigger world. I'm doing this work about extractive industry in Finland. I'm talking about the Arctic and the transformations due to climate change in the Arctic. These are things I do want to talk about also to Europe, because Europe doesn't seem to hear, so. And also why I bring up someone like Paulina Fedorov, who also is going to be in Venice, although all her work is related to 300 Skoltsami in northern Finland. So we are talking about these kinds of relations. But what I want to bring in here is that, yes, it is viable to talk about violence also when we talk about art relations. And for me, for instance, I feel that the way that this Biennale machinery is producing a certain kind of artistry, which is read in a certain kind of context, which involves all of these economical relations and also the other relations in terms of the problems with environment, etc. And it is reducing the possibility of many artists' voices being heard, and the possibility of, or even the call for understanding multiple temporalities, multiple contexts. And I definitely would call for a kind of an undoing of this star machinery that I feel is actually making art, international art, quite narrow. Sorry, but yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I think it's a beautiful intuition that we can close with in terms of let's say, opening up the perspectives and looking at what the what the localities can offer, looking for, I think we've been through very beautiful proposition, whether, you know, like digging into your concept, Marco, again, thank you for this idea of radical permanence, of exploring, okay, what, you know, how can you opt for this radical permanence while not going for a complete conservative drawback is still, you know, like a tension that is going to be very exciting to explore, and it's really the work that is going to be explored. I think that the medium very much that we're using right now is interesting because although I will finish with this statement, but you know, like making contact is harder through Zoom. I met somebody like Oliver because I did a field trip, which was a long field trip in Mexico, and that's how we met, and that's how we've, you know, sustained a relationship together. But from now on, it's true that those kind of opportunities, you know, entertaining a network once it's created is made much easier by this medium, and I really look forward for, you know, like looking for more hybrid models where at least this kind of hypermobility model can start to get reduced, and I really invite all of you to think of but what kind of mobility, what kind of travel can we remove, what kind of travel do we have to keep. Personally, the ones I'll keep is the initial travel, and then, you know, to a place, let's say to Mexico. I went to Mexico 3 years ago, and I don't think I need to go back before a certain amount of time because I prefer to keep in touch with the people that I've met there from there, you know, like Oliver. Voilà, that's a small closing statement. Again, thank you for sharing these very rich and beautiful ideas that we had. Thank you to the ZKM for organizing all of that continuously. Like the ZKM has been really very prominent into thinking through these questions of how do we foster discussion through the pandemic. Thank you to Stefan as well, who's the architect of this entire program. And I think now we're going to follow with the next session. Bye, everyone.
Let me have a last word on that. So yes, thank you all from my side as well for this discussion. I think we touched upon quite some things, but of course we could talk for 2 more hours. I would just like to invite you, if you have questions, comments, anything that's on your mind right now, onto our Padlet, where maybe somebody could share the link again, and we collect our questions over there, and we might just take the open questions into the next session as well. So thank you, Pia, Marco, Edith, and Oliver for all being here. If you'd like to join the next session, you're also very welcome. And with that, I think we'll close the Mobility and Art Practices session. And with that, we also close the Zoom here. And we continue at 6:30 with Daria Mille and Matthias Gommel, and the session on the terrestrial exhibition making practices. So see you there.